modifications they want to make to the agenda?
Can I ask a question? It's just Spring Creek and Strand?
Yeah.
That's it?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any committee reports? Strand, have anything?
Connie isn't here, I guess, she's our committee member.
Yeah. She had texted me earlier today and wanted me to ask, wanted me to ask, if anyone knows what the manure management plan is for the turkey barn out by Twin Valley. She said there's been some piles of manure out there for several weeks. Is it?
Yeah, there's been five of them, so.
Is it right near the road or?
West end of the first barn, yeah.
Actually, there's a mound at either end of every one of the barns, stretching all the way from Highway 200 down to the trees, as near as I can see from the road. And they've been there for about 2 weeks, at least. I don't know I personally do not know the procedure for dispersal of manure from turkey barns, so I do not know if that's normal or abnormal, or if it is perhaps in an additional response to the flu. Maybe they're taking different steps because of the flu virus. I don't know.
Yeah,
I think that would be a question for Mark Christensen
yeah.
or Gary, either one.
Yeah, she said she had some more information on the avian flu virus, but I would assume bring it next week, or next month. So, in Spring Creek, I have nothing today. Scott had suggested, I don't know what your guys' thoughts are, and who was all at last month's meeting. I was not. But if we wanted to bring everybody up to speed as to what happened at last night's meeting, if we wanted to go through, Scott had ran out a bunch of copies of Mary Jo's report on the meeting last month with Mr. Gilchrist's answers.
No.
Do you guys want to go through that, or? Well, just kind of, Scott wants to
Few
bring us
people
up.
weren't there last time.
Well, not necessarily through the entire, we don't need to repeat the entire hour and 20 minutes of the phone call, but I just wanted to make sure that, because some people weren't here last time, and also in case anybody had additional thoughts based on the responses of from the attorney to the questions last time, if instead of just doing a cursory review of the notes and saying, yeah, that's okay, since the idea behind that meeting was to provide you with information that would be of assistance to you in properly drawing up any ordinances you might be considering, I thought you might want to quickly go through the broad areas and the responses to the broad areas to see if there's anything that was confusing or not completely laid out or has led to further questions since then. If it gets boring, we can give up. So anyway, we started the meeting. There was questions before we got to the prepared questions. There was a question about bonding against damage to roads caused by feedlot construction operations. Noted that county roads are up to the county. Township roads, there has been in the past, according to Mr. Gilchrist, some townships have pressed for that kind of bonding, especially prior to construction. At the county level, as we've heard from Gary Johansson, that's usually handled by a conditional use permit at the county level. It is possible for townships to augment that, however, if you can come up with an appropriate legal standard definition of untoward damage. questions that had come from members of the committees and boards. We asked about the level of relationship between county and townships. If what Norman County has said, that it's up to the townships, is that common across Minnesota? Mr. Gilchrist said, yeah, that's the way it works. As we noted, if we adopt strict ordinances and enforcement is required, and in addition to enforcement, if and when it comes time for someone to approach you with a variance, a request for variance, those will be the responsibilities of the individual township boards that enact the ordinances. Setting up the zoning committee, he went through how that could be set up. He mentioned townships originally starting with a 5-member review board. That's kind of untenable in our size townships, as we found with setting up our own, these own committees. So that's something to think about. If it's a minor set of regulations where you're not processing a lot of permits and conducting public hearings, the town board can appoint themselves as the planning commission. And he said, based on his experience, that's probably not an unmanageable situation. Probably if the ordinances are properly drafted, you're going to avoid litigation from the outset, and applications for variances will probably come in very, very rarely. In other townships across the state where they've had stronger ordinances against things like feedlots, fracking operations, wind farms, applications for variances run at a very low level, 1 year or 1 every couple of years, maybe. Townships banding together on ordinances, yes. He talked about it being an advantage. Adopting a zoning ordinance is a very big deal. If you're going to enforce it, if you find yourself in an enforcement situation, that's where it comes into money. You know, it could run into $20,000 to $30,000 in cost. But again, if your ordinances are plain enough and drafted properly enough, chances of an enforcement happening in our townships chances of it going far enough without anybody in our townships knowing about it seems to me to be a very slim chance that anybody's going to be, all of a sudden it's like, well, gee, Martha, is that a hog barn going up next door? It's almost to the roof. We must have been looking the other way. I don't see much of that getting too terribly much of a hardship on the townships, but it is a possibility. Jurisdictions, townships, if some of the townships have stronger setbacks than neighboring townships, his opinion, and I've had this opinion from another attorney, is that the restriction of the strongest township would apply to residences nearest to the borders of the townships. So that's something to consider, both for ordinances that you may enact and ordinances that townships near you may or may not enact. Working together, he went through this description of the joint powers agreement, the joint powers group. I think, Norman, that speaks to your concerns, your interests in having the township committees and boards join together, perhaps approach the county association of townships as a whole. Stop me anytime if you have questions or if there's anything you'd like to throw in or anything that's been brought to mind. Yeah, he mentioned the difference between an agreement and a separate organization. There's that to consider too. Again, I don't think anyone wants bureaucracy to get out of hand here by setting up whole new sets of bodies, additional governmental agencies. It seems once we started this a year ago, we had a list of 14 or 15 governmental agencies already in operation. But it is a possibility.
What do you mean?
The forming of a joint powers board. If the townships decided that they were going to set up a separate entity to deal with the feedlot operations in the county, then that would be a separate organization, subject to its own needs for insurance, attention to regulations, registration, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So would that be, for example, would that be if we decided if adjoining townships decided to have the same ordinances? Is that what we're talking about?
Yes, and the idea, the question is it wiser to do that as individual townships working together under a joint powers agreement, perhaps common enforcement, that sort of thing, but still working together, but as still as separate townships?
Okay.
Or setting up the North Dakota Joint Powers Board for feedlot needs.
Okay, gotcha.
I think that's what I got out of it.
It's kind of the implementation that it came to that, how to, rather than each township having their own zoning type, or then this would broaden it to 4 or 5 or whatever. But it sounded like complicated. It sounded a little complicated.
Yeah, yeah. And again, and somewhere in there, I think, what was that, Mark?
I said, you gotta look at the liability part of a joint powers agreement, because if, say, there is 5 townships that do this sort of thing, if there is an action in one of the townships, the other 4 will have to share the expense, time, etc., to work with it, because joint powers works, but it's also the liability part.
Absolutely.
Be careful, that's what I'm saying.
Just be aware of what you're getting into.
Right.
Yeah.
But that would be another advantage of doing it together.
It would be,
Because
advantages as
that,
well.
we would all be together, and if there was a problem, we would share the expense.
NATO sometimes works in Western Europe. Let's see. There's mention of the legal costs of setting up the joint powers board, that sort of thing. Municipal county setbacks, rural versus residential. No general rule on that. Each community sets up their own setbacks. Norman County has set up different criteria based on jurisdictional boundaries, and that's not all that unusual. There's recognition that you don't necessarily want intensive agricultural uses near municipal areas. That's the presumption that that's where more housing is going to be. We should be having intensive agricultural uses in ag areas. If you're living in the country, you're living next to farms and smells. If you're living in the city, there's a different sort of expectation. If I'm not living in the country, I shouldn't be faced with those sorts of impacts. That is a common argument for differing setbacks from a group of houses as opposed to individual houses. The committees have discussed over the year as to whether or not it's fair that a single residence should have greater or should have lesser protection than multiple residences. There's also the idea that if, as promoted in this statement and in the MPCA document about dealing with nuisances in agricultural areas, if a resident is planning to move into an agricultural area, it is incumbent upon them to become aware of the sights and sounds and smells and way of life in the neighborhood into which they are moving. That makes sense. It therefore would seem to me that it also makes sense that the converse is true, that those people already living in an agricultural area have the right to determine the sights, sounds, smells, and way of life of their neighborhood, and any commercial operation, including businesses attempting to enter that agricultural zone and change the use, the type of use of the agricultural area, should adhere to the same principles. That it is also incumbent upon them to not interfere or untowardly change the way of life already enjoyed by the residents who already live there. Agricultural zoning use or not. idea behind that is I have seen ordinances in some townships in Minnesota that, or counties in Minnesota, that provide a greater setback from hospitality-related industries than from residences. That means, for example, if you're running a B&B or a resort. I would imagine that, if I remember right, it was a county that had a lot of water areas, so they had a lot of resorts, lake areas, a lot of lake areas, that sort of thing. And again, as we've discussed, the question rises, you know, if it is a nuisance to have it within a mile of a bed and breakfast, if it's a nuisance to have it within a mile of a resort, why is it not a nuisance to have it within a mile of a residence? Or why is it a less nuisance? That's one of the questions that is driving consideration as to whether or not the ordinances currently in place are strong. Homes built within setbacks, no. That was passed about a decade or so ago, that the setbacks from feedlot to houses are reciprocal. If there is a feedlot, say you have a 1 mile setback, if there is a feedlot, then a residence cannot be built within a mile of it. Conversely. Has been discussed in previous meetings. If the township residents believe that the dangers to their health and their way of life is such that they don't want to live within a mile of feedlot, then to protect the citizens around them, perhaps they should not be encouraged to build a house within a mile of feedlot. Anyway, so the question is whether or not that is really a problem. Does that inhibit development? Meaning, if a feedlot comes, for example, if a feedlot is built, is anyone going to want to build a 7-house housing development a quarter mile away from it? Anyway. I am hypothesizing. I do not know if there is one single answer to that. Leniency on legacy landowners. That question came up because it was mentioned that that was something that Walk-On is considering. Walk-On is working with its own attorney out of Melbourne. And 2 meetings ago, they mentioned that they were considering an ordinance that would essentially grandfather legacy landowners into being able to have a feedlot closer to their own property or nearer to a residence on their own property than any other residence in the township. I don't think that's possible, and neither did Mr. Gilchrist. Again, he notes the problems of consistency. So if you are considering some measure of grandfathering in current operators in your areas, it's something that needs to be done with care. Feedlot trucks on road, fines put in ordinance for health violations. The value of a human life, that was a board member's question. And no, there really isn't. There's a health impact study done by the state that is trying to, tries to evaluate the value, to try to come up with some measure of the value of human life as to if there are health violations of health-related ordinances, is there a monetary value that can be put on that if you choose to have ordinances carry fines, which, as I recall, townships can up to the level of misdemeanor. Composting in winter, that's a question for Department of Animal Health. I do know that some counties and townships have ordinances that flat out prevent, or prohibit composting when the ground is or distributing, distributing manure when the ground is frozen. I'm not sure about composting, there was one about composting, but I'm not positive. Composting in nature. Do any Minnesota townships or counties have ordinances banning aerial dispersal of manure? It's one he hasn't ever seen. There are 10 counties in Minnesota and more than that in Minnesota that have done that, in Wisconsin that have done that. They started banning it in Wisconsin and it's spreading in Minnesota. It's mainly a practice conducted by dairy farms at this latitude of the country. And it's something that has been of interest to some of the townships because it increases the nuisance level and also the spread of disease. Not overstep authority regarding pollution standards. I think we're covering that very well. I don't think anything that anybody is considering would run afoul of BCA standards or EPA standards, as we've been discussing over the last year. Questions of townships being sued for feedlot regulations. Have they been sued? Yes. Have they been sued for anything other than procedural errors? Yes. Back in the 90s, there were some that were challenged. Those early challenges were generally because ordinances were passed after permit application procedures had already been done. And that's where they got into trouble. That's why I don't think any of our townships have any procedural problems of that nature to worry about. Because the townships have been very careful about making sure that they're proactive on this issue. You can get challenged for anything. Are any of the challenges successful on other than procedural matters? No, not really. If everything is set up properly, if the word is drafted properly. We've been doing this for, or these ordinances have been being written for a good 20 years, 95 on. And so I think they're pretty solid that they can draft ordinances that really will stand up against challenge or be a challenge for the idea if all feedlots could be limited to 300 animal units. He says if properly adopted and there's a rational finding to support it, it should be defensible. That becomes difficult, because you don't want to be seen as blowing a whole industry out of the township willy-nilly. But if you have legitimate reasons for citing concerns that back up the desire for that ordinance, I don't see why they cannot be drafted as such. For example, Lime Township, right by Mankato, has a flat-out cap of 100 animal units in their agricultural of their township. Flat out, been on the books for years. So there is precedent. It can be done. Mile setbacks. The question is, drawing circles around, as we've done at our previous meeting, drawing circles around the areas of a 1 mile setback, and whether or not that is overly aggressive, and if it will be zoning out feedlots. There really is no rationale behind it, except we don't like these feedlots, and we're trying to figure out a way to zone them out. If we drew those circles, I suspect there would be little area in the township to allow for a new home or anything new. The setbacks of an area kind of issue. Again, at present, there are no feedlots within the townships that are considered the ordinances that would be affected or would generate any kind of areas a mile from them where houses could not be built. So as such, rationale goes, that box is what I have collected from the last year's meetings, our handouts, the research, the surveys and studies. That's just what I got. I don't have copies of what Lisa's got, I don't have copies of what Amanda got, I don't have copies of what Connie had that have not been presented at this meeting. But we have all that research, and a lot of that research has to do with problems related to health issues, declines in property values, and general problems with the way of life of local residents that correlate directly, have been found in university studies to correlate directly with proximity to large feedlot operations. So there are definite health risks. For example, the simple fact that both MRSA, which is that superbug, the anti-resistant bacteria, and H2S, hydrogen sulfide, they have found emission levels of both from large-scale feedlots. They have found elevated levels of hydrogen sulfide emissions and of incidences of MRSA within 1, 2, and 3 miles of feedlot operations. The same is true of property values that decline exponentially in accordance with the distance from the feedlot. Both of those areas of concern are legitimate findings of fact that would support any measure of setback issue that any of you guys want to consider, any of the townships would want to consider. I see no problem in finding support for that. Let's see. Oh, can township electors vote for or against ordinances directly? Not really. That is something that is left to the township boards themselves. Can citizens sue the township boards? Really, no. There are other, basically, if the residents don't like what's happening, they vote the board members out. It's not to say that a neighboring township or residents of a neighboring township cannot perhaps sue a neighboring township. Personal attacks on supervisors, all that sort of stuff. Anybody have any other personal attacks to report on? I guess everybody's busy now. Too busy to paint. Proper procedures. If ordinance is done right, meet them, hire the lawyer. That's the best way to get it done. How best can this information be utilized? Information that the townships have gathered. Pertinent studies should be compiled, sorted as part of the report as evidence for the need for the ordinances. University and state reports carry more weight than kitchen rants, which, although perhaps legitimate, are not legal proof. There was also a Bear Park dairy farmer in the audience at the end of the meeting, talked about his concerns that the townships do not cramp the style of current operating feedlot owners who may want to expand, go in the future. And then there's something to be concerned about. Also, in all of the materials, there is the evidence that's been presented for the economic benefits, if there are any, towards having feedlots in the areas. If there is a short-term boom in construction jobs, and then more part-time and 2 full-time jobs in the area, more students in the schools in the area. There is material that we have on hand that do mention those economic benefits as well, and the social positives and negatives that do come with the change in the way the construction of the social fabric of the neighborhood that may or may not happen if hundreds of feedlots start operating within the borders. And there was mention about concern about water usage. A gentleman from Lake Ida was talking about a well that is now down considerably even without major feedlots around, and his concern, as many people have voiced over the years, about the at a time when people across the United States are going to be hunting for water. So,
And there was a question asked about how long it would take.
yes, and a mention was made that generally at a minimum, from time of deciding what you want in ordinances to getting ordinance passed, minimum of 6 months, at least a year. Because, well, you're familiar with the time it took us to get the ordinances drawn up for the moratoria, have the meetings, you know, have the hearing, have the time passed, and have the vote. You know, that, all of that has to happen again, should any township want to pass any ordinances that they may want to draft. Also, I would recommend that if you reach that level of seriousness in having your ordinances all together, I would recommend running by the Secretary of Agriculture in Minnesota and the head of the NECA. It's not required, but they would give input. That would also strengthen your hand when it comes to any possible litigation. So that all takes time. And lawyers, I know that was one of the reasons that Walk-On extended their moratorium, because they had been working with their attorney already for, I think, 2 months, maybe more. And he said there was no way he could have things ready within the 2 months left of their moratorium. So that's a hands-on example of how it takes time. So, as sort of, I saw it, and as Mary Jo got it down, that's sort of the gist of what we picked up from the meeting with Mr. Gilchrist. Does anybody have any other impressions?